Time Traveler's Pig represents pretty much everything that makes Gravity Falls a great show. It has Dipper and Mabel on an adventure, a great comic relief character, continuity by the boatload, Stan acting like just enough of a jerk that you can't help but love it, foreshadowing, Dipper and Mabel bonding, and a pretty standard plot in a kids show, but with a new twist. Many episodes of Gravity Falls feature one or more of these things, but I can't really think of another episode that does all of them. It is, quite simply, the complete package. I have to say though, the first time I watched it, I didn't really get where they were going with it. It seems like they were cramming a lot in without much purpose. I mean, they set up about 4 subplots early on. Stan has rigged a game at the carnival, there's a weird guy from the future wandering around, Mabel wins a pig, and Dipper and Wendy are hanging out. Aside from the last one, all these plots seem to get forgotten about by the midway point. But if there's one thing I have learned from watching this show, it's to give them time to develop things. Because everything at the start of this episode is setting things up for later. Right down to Pacifica's seemingly pointless appearance. The main plot here focuses on Dipper's crush on Wendy. Again, which makes this the 3rd episode out of the last 5 to focus on it. Yeah, I got to admit, this was already getting kind of tiring, and we weren't even halfway through the season at this point. But I do like the callback to Double Dipper here, as well as the foreshadowing of a later episode. You've also got to love Dipper's overthinking Wendy agreeing to hang out with him, thinking it means anything more than just Wendy having nothing better to do that day. The next 7 to 8 minutes has a lot of setting up for later. It's a little confusing at first, in fact it almost seems like the episode is over before they even reach the first ad break. But I really like how you can never really tell when this show is setting something up for later. I actually remember thinking the costume store Blendin Blandin mentions was a setup for later. I did find it kind of odd that the time travel device Blendin uses is a tape measure. Like, why? Is there some sort of joke there that I just didn't get or something? But anyway, once the time travel device comes in, that's where this episode becomes really fascinating. Now I know what you are probably thinking. Time travel stories in kids shows are a dime a dozen. And you're right. But think about what tends to happen in those stories. It's either a way to get the characters to have an adventure in another time period, or they change something in the past and then go back to the present day and find things have changed. But Gravity Falls does something I don't think I've ever seen before, at least not in a kids show. It explores the actual logic of time travel. Dipper goes back to stop Wendy from being hit by a ball, and even though he does things differently, the final outcome is still the same. No matter how much foreknowledge Dipper has, how many different ways he tries to stop Wendy from being hit, the same thing always happens. It seems time has a way of adjusting to ensure things always work out the same way, regardless of what you do. I don't think I've ever seen a time travel story that presents this as an idea. There are stories like Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban and the MLP episode It's About Time that say even if you do time travel, you can't actually change what happens. But I've never seen a story before that suggests time itself can adjust like this. Now eventually Dipper does succeed, and this is where another interesting bit of logic comes into play. Because Dipper's success comes at a price. By stopping Wendy from getting hit, Mabel misses out on winning her pig. So has the timeline decided after Dipper tried to change things so many times to give him a compromise, that he can stop Wendy from getting hit as long as Mabel doesn't win the pig? Perhaps I'm looking too deeply into this, but I certainly love this enough as an idea that I'm willing to say that that's what's happening here. Most of the 3rd act is just a lot of small time travel gags as Dipper and Mabel time jump. I did kind of wonder how they were changing locations, since there doesn't appear to be anything on the tape measure to control something like that. But I did like the bit where Dipper asks, "Which present are we in?" And Wendy says, "This is the best present ever." So ultimately, Dipper has to make a decision. What is more important to him? His sister or his chances with Wendy? But what I really like here is that Dipper thinks about this fairly rationally. He considers how big a deal losing the pig really is to Mabel. He also points out that Wendy getting hit means she starts going out with Robbie, who Mabel agrees is kind of a jerk. It's only after properly seeing how broken-hearted his sister is by the loss of her pig that Dipper decides to go back and fix things. Honestly, the sibling love between these two is just so genuine. It's not like Mabel doesn't understand the sacrifice Dipper made for her either, and she does what she can to make up for it by pranking Robbie. Now, some might want to criticise the ending because of the way they get Blendin Blandin into trouble, when the paradoxes weren't really his fault. But come on, he did leave his belt for Zeus to hold on to. Not to mention anyone with a voice that annoying should get some kind of comeuppance. I also like the idea that the effects of time travel are monitored and enforced by a governing body. In fact, I wouldn't mind seeing these guys come back sometime. I was kind of hoping that Stan's subplot might end up having a bit more significance, but Zeus's foreshadowing of how he gets dunked was still pretty clever. I swear guys, you have to watch each episode of this show at least twice in order to properly appreciate how clever the writing is. The only other show I've seen in recent years that I can say that about is my favourite TV show of all time. Then of course at the end we get some of the best continuity nods I've seen from any show ever. Like I said before, this episode is just packed full of everything that makes this a great show. The setups are done perfectly, Dipper's decisions make all the sense in the world, and there is just the right level of comedy and emotional aspects. But I think the time travel logic and the Dipper Mabel stuff is what really goes to the core of what makes this one of the best bits of television I've seen in the last few years. Sure, it's not perfect. I still don't get why the time travel device is a tape measure. The time jumping sequence in the third act is mostly just jokes. And maybe the continuity gets a little too heavy-handed at times. But in spite of all that, this is still probably my favourite episode of Gravity Falls' first season.